Hello and welcome to Subject to Change with me, Russell Hogg. My guest today is Edward Shawcross. Ed is the author of The Last Emperor of Mexico, which told the story of an Austrian archduke by the name of Maximilian and his adventures as the last emperor of Mexico. And by the way, that's an absolute belter of a story. And if you haven't got the book already, I strongly recommend that you get it. Ed and I talked about that story when he was on the podcast before, but today we're moving on to talk about the man whose idea it was in the first place to send Maximilian to Mexico, and that is to say Napoleon III. Anyway, welcome, Ed, to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me. Delighted to be here.
So when we talked about Maximilian in Mexico, and that was quite some time ago now, you said you were working on a book about Napoleon III, and I don't quite know what stage you were at then, but how's it going?
We're very close to completion, so I finally managed to submit the latest version of the manuscript, which is being copy edited and all going well, should be hitting shops sometime in June next year. But it has taken, as you say, a long time. It's as we'll discuss, there's a lot that happens in his life.
I suspect amongst the listeners, there'll be lots of them who know exactly who Napoleon III was, and they'll just say, well, let's get on with the story. But I also think there might be a few who, they'll have known there was a first Napoleon, but they'll be amazed to hear that there was a second one, never mind a third. So I thought maybe it might be worth just giving people a bit of an orientation on what time and place we're talking about and how Napoleon III fits in.
Absolutely. Now, people often look slightly bemused when I explain that I've been working on a biography of Napoleon III. They just assume that there wasn't one or that I've made a mistake. And what I really mean is Napoleon I. I can assure listeners there is a Napoleon III. He becomes emperor of the French in 1852 and creates the French Second Empire, which is actually rules France for longer than his uncle. So he's a major figure in the 19th century, but he's one of those ones who has slipped through the cracks of historical memory and as I say, can often lead to amusement and puzzlement whenever he's mentioned. So let's just establish who he was in relation to the original Napoleon, because that is absolutely crucial to understanding this story. He's a nephew. So he is the son of Louis, one of Napoleon's brothers, and as well as his mother, who's Hortense de Beauharnais. So she is the daughter of Josephine, the first empress, who Napoleon I divorces, so becomes Napoleon's stepdaughter in typically bizarre Bonapartist. Napoleon can't have children with Josephine, so he alights on the innovative solution of marrying his stepdaughter to his brother, Louis Bonaparte. They have 3 children, the first of which dies young, age 5. So Louis-Napoleon, as he's known. So the trouble with this story is everyone's either called Louis or Napoleon. Before he becomes Napoleon III, he's most commonly known as Louis-Napoleon. That's confusing because his older brother, who does survive, so remember there are 3, is called Napoleon Louis. There's only so many combinations of Louis and Napoleon you can have. But keep it simple. We'll talk about Louis-Napoleon or Napoleon III. The nephew of the more famous Napoleon, who everyone's heard of. And so he's born as an imperial prince into the Napoleonic Empire, and in fact, an important one, because as I said, Napoleon doesn't have legitimate heir at this point when Louis-Napoleon is born. And he settles the succession, should he die, to his brother's children, first Joseph and his male heirs, but Joseph has no male heirs. And then to Louis. He's disowned his other 2 brothers, Lucien and Jerome at this point, which is something that happens quite frequently. And so Louis-Napoleon, when he's born, of the next generation of Bonapartes, is second in line to the throne after his older brother. So he is important in the succession. And as an imperial prince, he's very important within the Bonaparte family and grows up expecting to be very close to power in one of the most extraordinary and powerful states, I suppose, in modern history. So that's where he's kind of situated in the Bonaparte family.
But as you sort of intimate, he's expecting to, well, initially everyone's expecting him to be in a powerful position, but he's born, I think, in 1808, and 7 years later, it all comes crashing down. So you're writing a biography of Napoleon III, and I always find, the bit where they talk about the childhood, that's the boring bit in a biography. I think, come on, can we get onto the main theme? But in the case of Napoleon III or Louis-Napoleon, I guess his childhood is quite interesting because it must have been so weird for him growing up in the shade of Napoleon I, and also as a focus for all the people who want to see a Bonaparte back in power.
Yeah, you're right, and I agree with you. I mean, having written a couple of biographies, probably shouldn't say this, but I also find that childhood period fairly tedious, where you have to go through, what they studied and what their life was like. And actually, with Maximilian, I kept it short for that very reason. Louis Napoleon, though, has a fascinating childhood and early adulthood, and in fact, we'll get into what happens later. But he doesn't come to power as president of the Second Republic, which I'll explain later, until he's 40. And he dies in his mid-60s. So actually, it's only a third of his life that he's in power. Two-thirds that kind of make him the man that he is are fascinating. So yes, he's born into imperial splendor, but as you put it, things don't go quite as Bonaparte's hoped, let us say. In 1814, of course, Napoleon is exiled, and then he comes back with the 100 Days, which is really important for the Napoleonic myth, and indeed Louis Napoleon's understanding of the Napoleonic myth. That also doesn't go well. The Battle of Waterloo, of course, famously ends any prospect of that regime continuing. And so then Louis Napoleon, he grows up in exile. And in fact, there's something that's called the White Terror. So the Bourbon kings are imposed by the Allies for the second time after Waterloo. And this time they'd been fairly lenient, and there's, of course, this rather bizarre historical joke of exiling Napoleon to Elba. I mean, that couldn't have gone worse, right? So Napoleon is sent to St. Helena, and his supporters in France persecuted. So there's an official terror where leading generals, and these are the ones who have joined him during the 100 Days and are seen as the most egregious Bonapartists. They're rounded up, put in prison. Many of them are shot, famously. But there's also, perhaps even more terrifying, bands of royalists sort of roaming in various parts of France who are just lynching anyone associated with the imperial regime. Louis Napoleon, with his older brother, is in Paris. He's actually, most of the Bonapartes aren't in Paris for 100 Days because they've fled to exile in Italy and various other places. But his mother, Hortense, who was incredibly close to Napoleon, one of his preferred family members, and he didn't have many that he genuinely liked, and she was devoted to him completely. I mean, he transformed her life. She's the daughter of Josephine. Napoleon acts as protector. If you know your Napoleon history, Josephine is about to be executed during the Terror. And she has two young children, and things are looking pretty bleak until Napoleon comes into their lives. And then they're suddenly raised in, her brother, Eugene, becomes viceroy of Italy. And she is loyal to the last, and she keeps the flame burning for Napoleon, which she teaches to her son, Louis Napoleon. Now, in an extraordinary approach to parenting, Louis Napoleon's father, Louis Bonaparte, is, I think it's fair to say, an odd man, suffering from various mental and physical complaints. He sees the Napoleonic Empire that his brother created not as raising France to incredible heights of glory and prosperity and grandeur, but actually as a massive imposition on his own life. He thought he should have been a man of letters. He wrote an appalling novel. Napoleon kept doing things that kept him from his hobbies, like making King of Holland, for example, which he abdicates in 1810 because Napoleon wants to turn it essentially into a French colony, and Louis Bonaparte's got all kinds of bizarre ideas that he should be an actual king ruling independently. So Napoleon gets rid of that. He flees to Bohemia, into exile, leaving his two sons in the care of their mother. After 1815, he decides that he wants a son back, but only one. So he takes the elder brother into custody, and they grow up in exile in Italy. So that's Napoleon Louis. Louis Napoleon stays with the mother. Now, Hortense is distraught to lose her eldest, and Louis Bonaparte's response to that is, well, you're lucky that I don't want the youngest. And so I suppose on one level, it's quite fair. If you've got two children, then you separate, right? You get one each. But it's, as I say, I think it's a fairly unusual approach. But Louis Napoleon has by far the better part of it. So he grows up in exile. They wander to various places. The Allies have secret police intercepting Hortense's correspondence. Long story short, they eventually settle in Switzerland, and she buys it's a wonderful chateau overlooking Lake Constance on the Swiss-German border as it is today. Louis Napoleon grows up there, and in his teens, there's a revolving cast of sort of degenerate, wastrel Bonapartist adventurers who are sort of hangers-on, and as he grows up, he's told these extraordinary tales of Napoleonic daring-do and boy's own stories from these kind of veterans who've been cashiered and put on half pay by the Bourbons. So there's this hatred of the borderlands, this love of empire and Napoleon. And the house he grows up in, Hortense, has turns it into a museum, a shrine almost to Napoleon. So you can go and visit the museum today. It's fantastic. And on the globe in the living room, you can see where Louis Napoleon has marked St. Helena on the map to remind you where his uncle is in exile. But what's interesting about that is that he's growing up very much outside of the corridors of power and outside of the French elite, right? Who most of the French elite, royalists, Bourbon supporters, legitimists as they're called, they hate the Bonapartes as parvenus for destroying France, as the political rivals. So he's growing up very much outside of the kind of norms and customs of society, which he would do. But he's also growing up with his mother, who delights in conspiracy and secrecy, because when she's being constantly surveilled, she's seen as a potential kind of centre of Bonapartist resistance should it ever rise again. And so she's always sprinkling in misinformation into her letters to confuse the allies and make it look like there is some kind of conspiracy going. And she's a hilarious game for her. And so she teaches her son that duplicity, mendacity, lies, if you will, are sort of par for the course, and in fact what one needs to do in order to succeed. And of course that's something that Napoleon himself, anyone with even a cursory knowledge of history will know that his relationship with the truth was interesting, shall we say. So he's got this belief that he's destined to greatness because of the name, but he's growing up in a conspiracy, misinformation, and he's got this mother who he absolutely adores, and she adores him in this sort of secluded Swiss hermitage where they spend nearly all of their time together. So he's got this really interesting mix in his younger years, and then as he comes into adulthood, he gets mixed up in revolutionary politics in Italy because his father decides that he does want to see a little bit of his younger son, not too much, but what they should do is winter in Italy. It's very cold in Switzerland in the winter. So Hortense and Louis Napoleon will come to Italy in the winter and spend time. He'll spend time with his father. Hortense won't spend time with Louis Bonaparte, by the way, but the two absolutely loathe each other. And in fact, Louis Bonaparte said that his entire life was ruined by marrying her. I think Hortense's life was probably ruined much more. He's a rather horrible, nasty piece of work, Louis Bonaparte. But anyway, in Italy, he gets swept up in Italian nationalism. As I say, the Bonapartes are on the outside, and they're a ridiculous bunch, the male Bonapartes. You've got Jerome there as well, Lucien too, and they're pompous and they're vain and they're venal and they're constantly complaining they don't have any money, but living in these magnificent palaces that they've managed to squirrel away riches from the empire. But Hortense, as I say, she's more interesting in a way, and she's more liberal, and she has these famous salons in Rome, and they attract people who are disaffected with the order imposed after 1815. And in Italy, especially, they've restored as much as they possibly can the kind of patchwork kingdoms and autocracies, most of them related to the Habsburgs. Northern Italy is controlled by the Austrian Empire as well, and that's a great kind of bugbear of Italian nationalism. And Louis Napoleon, particularly through his brother, in fact, gets drawn into the world of the Carbonari, when this is what we today would call a terrorist organization. And probably a lot of the people in power would have considered it that too. It's revolutionary, it's radical, it wants to bring in elements of democracy, and crucially in Italy, it wants to have a united Italian nation state. So Louis Napoleon spends a lot of his time in smoke-filled taverns plotting and conspiring about how to bring this up. So there are so many interesting influences because you've got that radical revolutionary politics. There is that legacy within Bonapartism itself of that as the safeguarders of the revolution. But of course, you've got all the kind of the militarism and the glory and the authoritarian nature. And then you've got these various different mixes from his mother. He gets his tutor is actually the son of a revolutionary hero, Philippe le Bas, who was thought that life after Robespierre would be so terrible that he committed suicide. And he's Louis Napoleon's tutor for 7 years. So you've just got this incredibly eclectic combination of influences on his early life, and all kinds of escapades and adventures ensue from that.
I want to move on a little bit because not only does he get involved in Italian revolutionary politics, quite young, he's 28 when he decides what France really, really wants is the Bonapartes back in power. And he launches some sort of a farcical coup in 1836. I mean, and there's another one in 1840. So do you want to just sort of move us on to the coups and what on earth he was thinking?
No, I will do. I'm afraid I'm going to have to take you back very quickly to 1831, though, and 1832, because these are really formative moments. So he joins a revolution that aims at Italian nationalism in united Italy. It's a disaster. He joins it with his brother. It's a typical rich kid thing. He runs away from his parents. They're completely aghast when they discover. He says, "We're fine. Send us loads of money. It's going to be glorious." It's not. It's a complete disaster. A few thousand people, if that, rise up and are swiftly crushed by the Austrians. Now, the great tragedy for Louis-Napoleon in this is that while on the run, his brother catches measles and dies. And so his brother, although they had been separated, were incredibly close, probably the person he was closest to after his mother. So it affects him enormously. And his father is absolutely outraged, blames him for the death of his older brother, even though his older brother probably was leading him on rather than the other way round. I won't go into it, but it's brilliant. They have to, the Austrians are after them. Hortense goes to rescue him. They go to Ancona. They hide out in a villa. That villa is sequestered by the Austrians. Then Louis-Napoleon has to dress up as his mother's servant and escape through a garrison of troops. Anyway, the next year, is important because Napoleon II, who we probably should just clarify, is the legitimate heir of Napoleon. He never, in fact, reigned as Napoleon II, but he was known as Napoleon II. He's never reigned, but the politicians get Napoleon out of Paris in 1850 and say, sure, you abdicate, we'll put your son in power, and they never do. He dies in 1832. So his brother and his cousin, the two people ahead of him in the succession, die. And when we talk about these coups d'etats in his later life, there is this, he is obsessed with his destiny. He believes he will live what he calls a providential life. But it is important to remember that until 1832, he is a facilitator to the restoration.
Right.
But with the death of these two people, he becomes of the next generation of Bonaparte's next in line. Now, he's not actually next in line because Joseph is still alive. Indeed, his father is still alive, and they are the designated heirs. And remember, this is an imaginary kingdom, an imaginary empire, right? And it is ridiculous. So he thinks he can restore his uncle's empire without the permission of his family, who are completely against the idea. All they want is to get a bit of money from the French government and be allowed to return to France because they've been banished in perpetuity, on pain of death, in fact, after 1850. So Joseph especially is really annoyed as head of the Bonaparte family that he's got this young nephew who's sort of writing pamphlets about how the empire will be restored. And it is absurd. I mean, it's almost like in the 19th century if someone in Britain said, well, I'm going to recreate the Commonwealth of Cromwell. Right. I mean, it's closer in time, of course, so it's not a perfect analogy, but it's been crushed not once but twice, the Napoleonic Empire. There's no Napoleonic party. There's incredible nostalgia for Napoleon that is growing in popular culture, in songs, in literature, but there's no political program. There are no Bonapartist politicians in Paris, for example. And so Louis-Napoleon takes it upon himself to restore his uncle's empire. And he decides in 1836 that the way to do this is to do what his uncle did in 1815, which is to present himself before the French army. Remember the famous moment on the Flight of the Eagle up from the south of France where Napoleon presents himself before the troops and says, look at me, I'm your emperor, shoot me if you will. And there's a loud chants of long live the emperor, and he's carried in triumph to Paris. Now, listeners will be aware there's a bit of a difference between Napoleon doing that, having been emperor and one of the greatest generals that history has ever seen, and an unknown nephew doing that, who has literally done nothing apart from take part in a failed revolt and written a few pamphlets. Anyway, Louis-Napoleon has got complete belief that the name Napoleon, he managed to procure an eagle standard as well. So he's got that, and he thinks once the soldiers see that'll work. He's got a man on the inside as well in the garrison. So this is at Strasbourg in 1836 in October. The plan is to, as I say, present himself before a garrison. They'll acclaim him emperor. They'll march on Paris, and people will flock to the Napoleonic banner. It doesn't go. The first one doesn't go terribly to begin with. Starts off quite well. One of the regiments does rally. They're marching through Strasbourg. They're singing Bonaparte's song, chanting Long Live the Emperor. But the problem is it's not been perfectly planned, and Louis-Napoleon gets lost on the way to the next barracks where he wants to win over the regiment. So instead of approaching it from the ramparts where they could have looked down on the courtyard and sort of intimidated the garrison there into joining the revolt, he goes through a sort of side door into the courtyard. You can't bring many of his men in because it's a small entrance. And the soldier's incredibly confused. And one officer turns to another officer and says, what's going on? And the officer says, oh, they're proclaiming an emperor. And then the officer says, but the emperor is dead. And he said, well, it's the emperor's son. And he said, no, the emperor's son is also dead. And he says, well, it's a nephew, it's an emperor. So people are getting a bit suspicious. A slightly low trick is then pulled by one of the other officers who's saying that's not the nephew of the emperor at all. It's an imposter who's been put up by one of the sort of local officers as the trick, and all the soldiers are aghast. There's a scuffle. There's shouts of "Long live the king! Long live the emperor!" Louis-Napoleon is eventually bayoneted, not bayoneted, but sort of pushed by bayonets back against the wall and ends up surrendering. And is taken prisoner. He's locked up in the kitchen. So it really doesn't go well for him. Now, this should have disabused him of any romantic notions that there was, that the army remains loyal to the memory of Bonaparte, because, of course, it has demonstrated itself to be loyal to the king, despite winning over a few converts. But Louis-Napoleon doesn't come to that conclusion. He comes to the conclusion that it went wrong because he took a wrong turn. Mm. So actually, in 1840, the plan, plan B is to play plan A better. Now, he's been living as an exile in London. So he was in Switzerland. The French government say, you're conspiring against us, you have to leave. He'd actually been sent to the United States of America, but his mother's dying. He comes home. The French government don't give him permission to travel. But remember, this Louis-Napoleon is not a man to be troubled by that kind of thing. He just gets a fake passport. He's great at disguise. He sneaks into Switzerland. When the French government find out, they expel him. He goes to London, where he becomes a very fashionable dandy. He's hanging out with a rather disreputable set in a place called Gore House, which is in then very unfashionable Kensington, with people like Charles Dickens. And having a wonderful time. And all of the British people who meet him, like Benjamin Disraeli, for future Prime Minister, for example, they all say, well, he's perfectly pleasant, very charming, very polite, doesn't have any of the genius of his uncle. Mm. And he's also slightly mad, because in conversation, he's always dropping in what he will do when he's emperor. So he'll be talking about the weather or about traffic in London. And then he'll say, well, when I'm in Paris, of course, what I'll do is I'll open wide boulevards. And at that point, people think, okay, there's something wrong here. Now, in 1840, Napoleon I, his remains are being brought back to France from St. Helena. Huh. So what better way to welcome the corpse of the emperor than a restored empire? So despite the fact that very few people are interested in a restored empire, Louis-Napoleon attempts an even more farcical seizure of power. This takes place by sea. So a pleasure steamship is chartered ostensibly for a pleasure cruise to Germany, but men and horses and weapons are loaded on board at London Bridge, without the captain noticing. As they get out to sea, the captain is surprised to find Louis-Napoleon burst in to his cabin and say that the ship has been commandeered for events that will change the course of history. Proclamations are read out, lots of drinking. There's huge amounts of alcohol on board, and the plan is to descend on Boulogne, close to obviously to Britain. So we're not going to Germany. They disembark. Crowds are cheering Bonaparte is noticeable by their absence. But that doesn't deter Louis-Napoleon's band of brothers, as it were, although it's worth pointing out that he couldn't get enough men for it to look impressive, and he actually had to use an agency that hired out domestic servants to bulk up numbers. It's a rather motley crew of disillusioned former Bonapartist officers and literally hired help. Again, the plan is to present himself before a garrison. Again, he's got a man on the inside, but this time it's even more disastrous than the previous attempt, because none of the garrison rally. The officers are all loyal. The troops chase them out of the barracks. Then there's a sort of rather comical sort of game of hide and seek around the town as the National Guard and the army are called out. And at Boulogne, there's a column to the Grande Armée that was never actually finished. They haven't got a statue on top of it, but celebrating Napoleon's attempt to invade England, which never transpired. And there's sort of Bonapartist home instinct kicks in. The rebels run to the column. Louis-Napoleon gripping onto the iron rails that around it, saying, "I will stand here and die." The supporters say, "No, my prince, we need to save you." So they manhandle him down to the beach. They get into a rowing boat. They think they can get back out to the ship. Turn up, shot fired, boat capsized, which probably saves his life. The bullets smash into the hull of the ship. He's a very strong swimmer. Grew up near Lake Constance, used to swim across it all the time. But eventually he's fished out of the harbour. And There's only two Napoleonic things about this, really, is that someone takes pity on him and puts a great coat over him, because although it's August, he's freezing cold from having had an early morning swim in the channel. The second thing is that they discover on the steamer, the Exile, amongst all kinds of bizarre things like poetry that he's written, a live eagle. And it turned out that one of his supporters, while they'd been waiting for Louis-Napoleon to board the steamer in the Thames, had spotted a boy with a live eagle chained up, and had gone up and asked him how much it was and secured it for £1. So it had been tied to the mainmast of the ship, and because it would be wonderful to have an eagle for the restoration of the empire. The eagle actually becomes a minor celebrity in France because it's so absurd and so ridiculous. Then all of these wonderful details are reported in the press, and the eagle manages to escape, and it's living up right until 1849. As I say, it takes on a whole life of its own. But the eagle is not our story. Our story is Louis-Napoleon, who, it's that classic thing, isn't it? It's what is it? I always get it wrong. It's once shame on you, twice shame on me.
Right.
The French government, the first time they had said, it was so ridiculous, we're not going to put you on trial, we're not going to execute you, because it will give you a public platform if we give you a trial, and if we execute you, you'll make you a martyr. Just go away. The second time, they say, well, you've got form. So they lock him up in a fortress.
But why don't they execute him? Because it's high treason. Is it because it's so absurd with eagles flapping around?
Yeah, no, it absolutely is. It's the absurdity of it does take away from the fact he's committed high treason. Not once, of course, but twice. And in fact, this is the third time that King Louis Philippe, we should tell listeners, there's been a revolution in France. There's another monarchy, the July monarchy, junior branch of the Bourbons. They've been put in power in 1830. So in 1831, remember when he took on that failed revolt, he actually escaped to France, where he had been banished on pain of death. The king pardons him. In 1836, high treason, the king pardons him, sends him into exile. In 1840, you think, right, so this is the third time, so, 3 strikes and you're out. But remember, the remains of Napoleon are coming back in 1840, and the July monarchy has got this fantastic, it's an absolutely wonderful kind of pageantry that they've organized for him. Hundreds of thousands of people come from across France to see the funeral procession of Napoleon before he's interred in the Invalides, where he is now. And to execute the nephew at the same time as you're bringing back the remains of Napoleon is something that would just be a public relations misstep. So there's only one, so he's tried in the French equivalent of the House of Lords, there's only one peer who votes for execution. Everyone else says, he probably deserves pity rather than that kind of bloody punishment. We shall just lock him up for life. And so he's put in prison for life. And he's got good aphorisms and good quips. He supposedly says, because he's been banished and exiled from France, at least I will die in France.
So he's in prison for life. How does he take to it? As I understand it, he sort of develops a slightly serious streak and starts writing more than just pamphlets. He starts writing something a bit more meaty.
He does, yes. So he's ideally suited to prison as far as anyone can be, because he grew up, as I say, in semi-seclusion in Switzerland anyway. He had a very austere tutor who made him study on long hours on his own, and he's very happy as an autodidact, reading, noting, writing. He's a great pamphleteer, and he's got a huge belief in the power of the written word to shift public opinion. And later he referred it to as to university. It was where he came of age intellectually. And what he does is he sets about transforming his reputation and the reputation of Bonapartism from a kind of a ridiculous figure of fun into a serious political program. And he does this by writing articles for the press. The most famous one he writes it's called The Extinction of Pauperism. If you have to write it now, it would probably be Make Poverty History. Now, it's part of a kind of a genre that's popular at the time amongst the middle classes in France of sort of utopian socialist literature. Socialism is just beginning to develop and catch the attention of people in France and in Europe and the United States to some extent. But he says, and he writes to a friend, he says, I'm going to do something that will do enormous good for the working people of France, but also enormous good for myself. Because what he's doing is he is branching out the kind of political manifesto of Bonapartism, if you will, to appeal to a wider spectrum than the July monarchy, for example, and even some Republicans. The July monarchy, it's in power, it's a liberal bourgeois government, or caricatured as one. It's got an incredibly restricted franchise. What Louis Napoleon is arguing for is social reform. He's arguing for universal male suffrage, so to be franchised from 200,000 just over to 9 million. Anyone over 21 years old, French male can vote. So you've got that radical element that he brings in, and that people begin to take him seriously as a political thinker, much more so than they had in 1840. While he's in prison, he corresponds with George Sand, the famous novelist, who's very much a sort of middle class left, and Louis Blanc, who is a socialist and becomes very important in the 1848 revolution. They're all intrigued by this imperial pretender with a social conscience and an eclectic range of political ideas. So that time in prison is incredibly important to him because it allows him to develop a political program, which, if he can harness the popular nostalgia for Napoleon, we mentioned 1840 and the return of his remains. As I say, hundreds of thousands of people turn out in Paris to watch this. It's a huge event. I mean, it's probably, it's the event of 1840, if not the event of, the 1840s until we get into the revolution. If he can harness that nostalgia behind a political program and present himself as a serious political figure, there is an enormous constituency should politics take a democratic turn in France.
Yeah, but the problem for Napoleon III or Louis Napoleon, I don't know if we can call him Napoleon III yet.
Not yet.
But the problem for him is, he can have all the brilliant programs he likes. He's in jail for life. So did they make the mistake of letting him go? I mean, how does he...
Yes. So it's typically picaresque, I suppose, for him. So in 1845, he gets a letter. So his father's completely disowned him. He blames him for the death of his son. The first time he attempts a coup d'etat, he thinks that is a betrayal. The second time, that's it. He cuts off all contact. He writes to him in 1845 to say that he's dying. And his final wish would be for his sole remaining son to be at his bedside when he dies. Obviously, the problem is he's in prison. So Louis Napoleon writes to the French king and says, "Could I have a week off?" And I promise to come back. And the French king, understandably, denies that request. But he says you can actually, even better, you can have complete freedom. All you have to do is ask for a pardon. Louis Napoleon refuses to ask for a pardon because, of course, to ask for a pardon, you have to admit that you've done something wrong. And he doesn't believe he has done anything wrong. So does he get out of prison? Well, in 1846, they're doing work on it. Now, I should have said he's in a fairly salubrious accommodation. It's a medieval fortress, but he's got 2 rooms on the first floor, which he's done up rather nicely. But there's a problem with the damp, as there often is in these medieval dungeons. And so they're doing work. Workers come in. And they're checked rigorously, lined up and inspected. And they're lined up and inspected on the way out. But what Louis Napoleon notices as they're working is that during the day, workers can come and go freely. They need to go and pick up deliveries, whatever it is. And there's hardly any checks on them at all as they come in and out during the day. So he thinks, aha, I've already shown my talent for disguise, escaping from the Austrians. Here is another chance. And so he gets his loyal valet, who's come to prison with him, to procure the ubiquitous signifier of French working class, working blouse, costume, clogs, everything, specially designed clogs. Louis Napoleon is short, 5'4". These clogs give him an extra 4 inches, so they're going to change his height. The other distinctive thing about him is his facial hair, which, really from early adulthood, he always has a moustache and a goatee beard. And he shaves that off, although he shaves it off at the last moment because he thinks it's so distinctive. If the workers don't come in that morning and the commandant of the prison sees him without his moustache and beard, he'll know, you're trying to escape. So he sees the workers come in, he shaves, he rubs dirt into his face, he puts on a wig, he puts on a blue brows. He's really got into the role. He's got his clogs on with extra height. He'd made bookshelves for himself in his rooms. He takes down one of the bookshelves as a plank, puts it across his shoulder, walks down the stairs, and as soon as he comes out, one of the guards is outside his room. The guard stares straight at him, no recognition. Walks across the courtyard. He's also got a dog with him as well, which helps distract the firm favourite of the prison guards there. So that's distracting them. He's walking out, and he's got a cheap clay pipe, the kind of smoked by a French worker. But so unused is he to smoking it that as he's walking along, he drops it and it smashes on the floor. Everyone turns to look at him. But cool as he he picks up the pieces, carries on walking, gets to the front door. They open the front door and out he goes. He's done it. He's free. His valet, who's out running errands, comes with a carriage, picks him up, takes him to a train station, and they get the train to Belgium and then from there to London.
Yeah, London, the place where all the all the dregs of the earth congregate.
Absolutely right. Yeah, and it's the second time that he's in exile there, and he picks up where he left off with his literary set at Gore House, living the life of a dandy essentially.
But okay, so he's in London. He's had well, two failed coup attempts, one of which is absolutely ludicrous. Being chased around Boulogne, and yet 3 years later he is head of the government. So
Yes.
so what?
Yeah. So I mean, it's he has incredible self belief. He believes that the spirit of Napoleon watches over him, and I think that is not a metaphor. That he genuinely believes that Napoleon is looking down and saying that you are doing a good job. I think if the actual Napoleon had looked down at what he did in 1840, I suspect he would have been, he wasn't a man who suffered fools gladly. So, but anyway, that's what he believes. And when he's in prison, writes this astonishing account of his life, saying that it's been tremendously successful because he's resuscitated the Bonapartist party, and France knows there's an heir, and that now he's within, about 50 miles of Paris. So, but geographically, because he's in prison close to Paris. So he has that belief. And he believes that if politics become democratic, there will be huge constituency for him. And he's done the work with his political writings. But the July monarchy has survived for 18 years by 1848. There have been numerous attempts to overthrow it, some much more serious than Louis Napoleon's ones. But in February 1848, revolution comes again. And then, of course, sweeps across all of Europe. But it's not the first revolution in France, but it's the first one in a major country. And of course, France is, with its history of revolution, it's kind of sets the tone for Europe. Long story short, it's over reform. Remember, the July monarchy, the franchise is about 200,000, just over 200,000. And there's been a campaign to extend reform. There's been awful harvests in the previous winter. So there's terrible malnutrition, near starvation in the countryside. There's political discontent. Louis Philippe is a very sort of jowly, old, uninspiring figure by now, famously compared to a rotting pear. And so there's not much leadership at the top. And workers in Paris rise up, overthrow the king, and a republic is proclaimed. And that republic will be based on what Louis Napoleon has long argued for, universal male suffrage. That will be the basis of the elections, and then later in December 1848, the presidential election. So when Louis Napoleon hears, he said, "This is my moment." And he writes to a cousin, "A republic has been proclaimed, and I must be its master." To which his cousin replies, "You are dreaming, as usual." He turns up in Paris, a huge moment for him, of course, because he's been exiled from France. And he writes to the provisional government this wonderfully grandiose letter saying, "I put myself at your service." And they immediately reply saying the best way you could serve France is by leaving. Now he's got an acolyte, a guy called Persigny, who's a wonderful, even more Bonapartist than Louis Napoleon and more deluded. And he says, you should wait for them to drag you out and deport you because that will be good optics, as it were. But Louis Napoleon says, "No, I will go back. I'll pretend. I will appear to be a loyal citizen of the Republic, and I will then choose my return at the opposite moment." Now, the second Republic, as it's known, the first one, of course, during the first French Revolution after 1879, well, after Louis XVI is executed. Second Republic, it's tumultuous and street politics much more important than what goes on in a National Assembly. Louis Napoleon doesn't stand for the Constituent Assembly, as it is initially, he could have done. He's the terrible public speaker with no experience of parliamentary politics. Whereas you're going to have the great names of French politics in this chamber. So he doesn't want to stand. But by June, there's by-elections to this assembly, and his name is put forward. He doesn't campaign. There are no national newspapers. There's no organization whatsoever. But the name Napoleon resonates with voters, and he is elected. This causes outrage in the assembly because the provisional government and many other politicians see him as a criminal who's tried to overthrow the government of France. Even if they don't necessarily recognize the legitimacy of that government, they know his ambitions are not Republican, shall we say. So they try and exclude him. That just makes him more famous. And he does have a brilliant political instincts often. And there's sort of protests in the street, people shouting for Louis Napoleon to be allowed to enter into the assembly. And when he hears about this in London, he writes a letter saying, I stand for order, and I see against my wishes, I seem to be the cause of disorder. I resign my seat. I won't take it. Now, the government point out that given that he never took his seat, he can't resign it. But that doesn't matter. What people see is this grand gesture, this theatrics, which he's been very good at, actually, despite the absurdity of his attempts to take over power. And then you have June days in Paris, which is a week of, it's an attempted second, it could potentially even potential third revolution. The government has closed down the national workshops, which had been set up after February 1848 and provided employment for the sort of floating mass of impoverished people in Paris. They're expensive, they're inefficient. The government thinks we can't afford them, we have to close them down. People in Paris see this as a reaction. The revolution is being stolen. And this is bloody, much bloodier than the February Revolution itself. Barricades. I think it's something like 3,000 Parisians, off the top of my head, are gunned down by the National Guard, by the army, restoring order.
Gosh.
Yeah, so this is a huge moment. And it makes, of course, some people are very pleased that the sort of revolutionary scum of Paris have finally been taught a lesson. But it's hugely controversial. And Louis-Napoleon, where is he? He's in London, completely untainted by any involvement in it. So it turns out to be a masterstroke, not just because of the theatricality of his resignation, but he's out of politics during this bloody massacre of Parisians, which means that he can present himself as someone who is defending order. Bizarrely, he enrolled as a special constable in London during the Chartist demonstration or protest in April. But he can also present himself as a radical, someone who's long argued for universal suffrage, someone who's interested in social reform. And because he's not been leading the charge to crush the artisans and workers in Paris, that's believable in a way that for a lot of people in the provisional government who would have said they were on the left, it's not, because they have been responsible for crushing that particular insurrection. So he's perfectly positioned in September to sweep in another by-election, and this time he takes his seat in the assembly. It's a massive anticlimax because, as I said, he's an awful public speaker. He grew up, he's incredibly nervous for his maiden speech. He's written it out on a piece of paper, and it's incredibly banal. He just says, I'm loyal to the Republic. And anyone who's been to Paris and tried to speak French there will sympathize with this. What is picked up is not the content, but the way he says it. He's got Swiss German accented French. And this is the source of much ridicule in the newspapers, who say, unfortunately, we have to translate the speech of Louis Napoleon because it wasn't said in French, even though it is French and it is his first language. As I said, that's something that the visitors today might sympathize with. And he's ridiculed. And it's for those who feared an imperial restoration, this is a huge relief, because remember, they tried to keep him out of the parliament. They hear him speak and they say, phew, this man is a joke. He's not a serious guy. There's no threat. Of course, what these people don't realize is that mass democratic politics is far more than parliamentary speeches. They may be fine rhetoricians. There's people like Adolphe Thiers, who was important politician in July monarchy, becomes the important politician later. He does 3 hours speeches, which are wonderful and full of sarcasm and wit and erudition. But no one's reading these in the countryside and the workshops of Paris. No one's interested in this grandstanding by Republicans or monarchists. What they know about Louis Napoleon is that he's got the name Napoleon. What they know about Louis Napoleon is that he wrote a pamphlet saying that he was going to end poverty. What they know about Louis Napoleon is that he's long argued for universal suffrage. And they also know that he is not part of the French elite, even though he is born an imperial prince and he'd lived in incredible luxury while many people in France were starving, the life of an English dandy. He's seen as the anti-establishment candidate. The government's very unpopular because they've imposed a tax increase, which affects the countryside. And so Louis Napoleon is all things to all men, and it is all men voting. And he's untainted by association, not only just with the government, but with French politics stretching back to Waterloo. He's got a wonderful turn of phrase, not a great speaker, a good writer. And he's obsessed with Waterloo and how it's a defeat and a humiliation. His message is simple. It's one that will be familiar to people listening today. He's going to make France great again.
But at this stage, he's just an assemblyman. So how does he sort of take over the government?
Right. So the president is yet to be elected. Remember, the constitution has just been dreamt up. They're going to have a directly elected president. So the assembly is a constituent one. It's to agree on the constitution. the constitution is agreed. There's going to be a directly elected president. The elections take place in December 1848. And Louis Napoleon, I mean, there's the government candidate, but he's the man who's responsible for the repression of during the June days. The man who's responsible for seen as responsible for the tax rises, closing down the national workshops, even though he's not in power for some of those decisions. And he's very uninspiring, a very dour Republican figure, a moderate Republican as well. So none of the sort of dash and the radicalism that you get from the more colourful members of the Republican movement. And Louis Napoleon is, as I say, when the ballot paper goes out, he is seen as the man who will restore France to glory. Will end a sort of misery of the economic downturn that they had in previous years, and appeals across the political spectrum from radical left to authoritarian right. So he wins by an absolute landslide. He gets 5.5 million votes, becoming France's first ever directly elected president. And the nearest candidate in second place gets 1.5 million. Lamartine, the great poet and hero of the February Revolution, gets 17,000, which is, it's insulting. But he had been, the famous Patriot of 1848, you see him waving the tricolor flag in front of crowds of people. So it just goes to show how fortunes can change so quickly. So he's swept into power. It is a landslide victory and an extraordinary moment. I mean, this is the largest sort of experiment in direct democracy thus far in human history. If you take into account the United States of America, where of course they are electing presidents, but it's still through electoral colleges, and there's still a lot of restrictions based on property or of course race. This is in France. You have 9.5 million voters who can vote, and their vote is direct for the president. And when given the choice, everyone who had laughed at Louis Napoleon in London, in Switzerland, in Italy, when he said that what he would do when he was in power is in shock. He was right. He was right all along. The name resonates, the program resonates, the manifesto resonates, and he becomes president, much to the horror of the French political elite, who think he is an idiot.
Perhaps they're right to be horrified, because it doesn't take him too long before he thinks, well, being president is great, but being emperor will be even better. Why does he need to do that, and how does he pull it off?
So there is a lot of discussion when the Constitution of the Second Republic. They are worried about, because history looms so large in the minds of these politicians. And of course, if you know your French history, you go from republic to empire, and you have the nephew of the emperor very likely to become president. So it's not just republics go to empires, but it's very much a case of history repeating itself. It seems to be to politically and historically minded politicians. So Constitution of the Second Republic, the president cannot stand for re-election. How do we stop a military dictatorship style, 18th Brumaire, Napoleon takeover? I think, ironically, they alight on the one measure that's guaranteed to make it happen. Because he can't stand for re-election. What does he do? Now, he can have the constitution revised, but you need a 3/4 majority in what becomes the National Assembly. And in the summer of 1851, Alexis de Tocqueville, the great political thinker who had been instrumental in coming up with the constitution, he's part of committee to advise the Assembly on whether they should revise the constitution. He says they should revise it to allow Louis Napoleon to stand again. And he manages to get a majority in favour of revising the constitution, but not the 3/4 majority. And petitions are flooding in, 2 million signatures. There's quite a active, how shall we say this, Bonapartist movement that tends to have robust electioneering strategy of beating up political opponents, which probably helps. But he retains his popularity. He's as president. He had thought much longer and harder about mass democratic politics than any of the major rivals. So you've got monarchists who want to restore the monarchy. You've got Republicans who want to keep the republic going. It's being a very conservative republic, because the majority in the assembly are actually monarchists and they repress Republicans. But Louis Napoleon is somehow able to sort of stand above all of this and retain his popularity. And it's very divisive, tumultuous politics. And he's brilliant at provincial tours. He uses the train to go across France. He's one of the first to get the banal local speech done. He'll praise the area, throw in a vignette about Napoleon being here, and say how wonderful it is to see everyone. And I think for the time that was quite novel. So people reacted very positively to it. Lots of cheering. And so he retains his popularity, though hated by the political elite, right and left. And so once the assembly votes against revision, Louis-Napoleon is able to do what he's been doing throughout his whole presidency, which is say, I represent the people. My mandate comes directly from them. There is an elite stitcher in the assembly, which is trying to stop me standing from running for power again. Worse than that, the assembly passed a law which restricted universal suffrage. So about 3 million people are struck off the register. And that politician I mentioned, Adolphe Thiers, he called them the vile multitude. So it's not only is he spinning this brilliant narrative that it is me, the president, representing the people against the elites in the assembly. The politicians in the assembly are elites who are trying to stitch up the president, right? So it's not a conspiracy. He's right to some extent, and had he stood for re-election in 1852, he almost undoubtedly would have won. So, but he can't. So he launches a coup d'etat. Third time lucky. Turns out the way to launch a successful coup d'etat is to do it once you're already in power. The army are broadly on board. And enough politicians also. What people are terrified of, at least the bourgeois, well-to-do property classes, and indeed much of the peasantry in France, is the rise of socialism, the rise of the left. They're worried about a radical left republic being returned in 1852, either through revolution, either through the election of a president, or in national elections for the next round of the assembly. So what is a conspiracy is that Louis-Napoleon drip feeds into discourse that he needs to save society, because in 1852 will be a year in French history that is up there with the Jacqueries, with the revolutions, with the terror, unless he maintains power and restores order. So that is the justification for the coup d'etat. That's how it's sold to the French people, that he's saving society. He's shutting down the assembly, which is full of elites trying to thwart the will of the people. And I suppose where the genius lies is that there will be a vote. So he's going to put this to the French people once he's dealt with the assembly, locked up the necessary left and right politicians. And the people of Paris love it when he locks up the politicians from the right. I mean, they think this is brilliant. I mean, he puts people like Tocqueville is in prison. They don't mind Tocqueville so much, but people like Adolphe Thiers, there's a general called Changarnier. These are very right-wing figures who are clearly trying to restore the monarchy. And when they're driven through sort of in police escort to prison through the radical area of Paris, when they find out who's inside, they say, "Oh, that's fantastic. Well done. I'm glad those people have been locked up." They see the president as a man of the people who is going against the establishment. A lot of people think it's terrific. There is resistance, nothing like you get in June 1848 with the June Days. But there is resistance. Barricades go up, but it's ruthlessly crushed this time. And far fewer people died, probably about 400 than the 3,000 odd that you got previously. And of course, for Republicans, this is an illegal act that is never forgiven. To use the cliche, the regime is baptized in blood. He's illegally seized power. What Louis-Napoleon says is, well, there was no need to rise up against me because he puts it to the French people.
Right.
There's a plebiscite. He says the French people delegate the necessary powers to Louis-Napoleon to draw up a new constitution and essentially agree with what he's done. And over 7 million French people vote yes. And he says, this absolves me. I went outside of the law only to return to it, and this absolves me. Now, of course, any self-respecting Republican commentator says, well, for absolution, you need to have sinned. They don't see it as legitimate, but that's what confuses a lot of people, I think, in Paris, is when the posters go up saying what president's done. He says, well, and if you don't like it, you can vote. And it's not a free and fair election. That much is true. He shuts down freedom of the press, political opposition banned. Obviously, the leading political opponents are in prison. Yeah. So if this is a referendum, there is no campaign, if that makes sense. But equally, it's a secret ballot, and you can nothing's going to happen to you if you vote no. So for Republicans, Victor Hugo is the great enemy, and it begun early adopter of Louis-Napoleon as president becomes like a visceral hatred that it can really sort of deeply psychological. And a lot of his sort of literary output in the 1850s is vitriol against Louis-Napoleon. He says this is equivalent of someone robbing someone and then puts a gun to their head and says, "I need you to sign a piece of paper saying that I agree that what you took was indeed yours." But the numbers are not falsified. You can go and count them today. There's over 7 million people, and none of them are forced to vote yes. So, and I think what Hugo is doing is he's missing the point. The point is not to falsify or rig the election. It's not rigged. Under Napoleon, there have been plebiscites and elections. They were rigged, and there was a huge amount of apathy. In fact, people just didn't vote. There's lots of abstentions. Off the top of my head, I think it's over 2 million or so, or 1.5 perhaps. The thing is, for the system, which we can talk about a little bit in a minute, is the idea is that Louis Napoleon does represent the indivisible will of the people. So the repression is not to falsify or rig the election, but to show that the numbers are so overwhelming as to be uncontestable. So that's where that comes in. If it's a free vote in 1852, it's counterfactual, but he will win that. He will win that election. I think we can almost certainly say that. But he's not going to win by 7 million votes.
Okay, I want to sort of do a couple of maybe slight diversion away from the politics. There's a few things I wanted to talk about. I'm very interested in Roman history, and I think everyone can agree that Napoleon III is an ambitious man. And it's Julius Caesar who is perhaps absolutely famous for being an ambitious man. So, as I understand it, he has a bit of an obsession with Julius Caesar. And is this an antiquarian interest? Is he just interested in the history, or does he see himself as, is he trying to model himself on Caesar in some way?
No, he is obsessed with Julius Caesar, and he's one of the few emperors to write a serious scholarly biography of Julius Caesar, which is meant to be 3 volumes, but he only writes the first 2. He doesn't get around to the third. So it's a very serious interest. He does a huge amount for the classics in France when he's in power. But beforehand, it's something that he, of course, because in some respects, the French Revolution, the empire, is sort of ancient history cosplay, writ large, and everyone is comparing themselves to Brutus or to Caesar or whoever, depending on your political allegiance. Caesar is a very important individual in the kind of Bonapartist theory, such as it is, of history, up there with Alexander and Charlemagne. So it fits the imperial mode, but he's fascinated by Julius Caesar. There's a point when he's going backwards and forwards in the 1820s from Switzerland to Italy, where he stops at the Rubicon and fills up a small flask with its water, showing a complete lack of understanding of what a code name should be. The file we're planning his coup d'etat 2nd of December 1851 is called Rubicon. So you wouldn't have to be a great detective to have uncovered what's going on with there. But it's a genuine obsession. And when he comes to emperor, he writes a biography, which is incredibly detailed. It's sort of co-authored with various assistants and so on and so forth. But it's the sort of thing that's leveled against people nowadays. He's really obsessed with it, with ancient history, the archaeology, battle sites of Caesar in Gaul. He visits them, and he buys up land in Rome to sponsor archaeological digs. He sponsors a collection of inscriptions, of Roman inscriptions, and so on and so forth. So it's a real genuine interest. But of course, it perfectly fits his imperial ambitions, and Caesar, as a man of action, is someone that he's trying to emulate in the same way he's trying to emulate Napoleon, who Napoleon, of course, in the same way is trying to emulate Caesar, right? So it's a sort of virtuous feedback loop. In the preface to the biography he writes of Julius Caesar, which is probably the most interesting thing from a political point of view, he compares the death of Christ, the death of Caesar, to Bonapartism and the death of Napoleon. So this is how he's thinking, and the point being that you can kill Caesar, that doesn't stop Augustus. You can kill Christ, that doesn't stop Christianity. You can still kill Napoleon, that doesn't stop Bonapartism. So you can see, that's where he's positioning himself in the stars, as it were. So yeah, not short of ambition. Caesar, Augustus, Napoleon, Jesus, Napoleon III.
And then the next thing I wanted to talk about, I always have this image of France as being, in the 1800s, as being fantastically glamorous. And I don't know if that was true in 1848 or in the 1850s. But there was a woman that supposedly Napoleon III should have married, and that's Princess Matilda. And she ends up being, super famous for having one of the great salons of Paris. Do you want to just say a little bit about salon life in Paris and the intellectual glamour of the time? I mean, is my image correct?
Well, yes, and obviously this is just for a very small number of elite figures, but it is a great time of the salon, and Matilda becomes, one of the kind of leading lights of that scene, and she's really the first lady of France, unofficially, because well, for reasons we'll get into, he's got a very unsuitable partner who definitely can't be the First Lady of France. So Matilda is the one who is hosting her balls and so on and so forth. But salon life is integral to French culture and politics amongst elites, and it goes, it stretches right back. But this is definitely a sort of a golden age of it. And in fact, Louis Napoleon's mother, Hortense, had been famous for her salons during the Empire. They'd been the most glamorous, the party that everyone wanted to be at, partially because of the kind of the luxury and her charm and her manners, but also because she's right next to Napoleon. And Matilda, Bonapartes like to marry within themselves, as we know, right? We have the stepdaughter marrying Louis Bonaparte, the brother, and Louis Napoleon. He's incredibly, apart when he's not writing pamphlets to launch coup d'etats when he's growing up in Switzerland, he's incredibly bored, and he thinks something that might alleviate his boredom is marriage. The problem is, he and I don't, listeners can decide for themselves whether that's true or not. Problem with him is that he sees himself and his family see himself as absolutely in the upper echelons of the European elite. The European aristocracy see Bonapartes as outrageous parvenus, and wastrels, and gamblers. Mm. So there's no match. There's never going to be a match. So eventually they said, well, you just have to marry your cousin. His older brother had married a cousin, a daughter of Joseph, and his father, Louis Napoleon's father, bizarrely wrote a letter saying that she reminds that his brother's wife reminded the father of Louis Napoleon. So they looked alike, which is it's a very strange thing to write, that your brother is marrying someone who. Anyway, I digress. But so it's a fair. She's only 15. They have a pretty chaste romance. Louis Napoleon, I should have said, he's a great romantic. He grows up in the age of romantic literature, and in fact, it's German romantic literature as much as French, or more than French. He's fluent in German and Italian from his youth, and so he sort of plays up to the tropes of the time. And what you have to remember about all of this, though, is that it's exactly at the time he's plotting his first coup d'etat. So I think how serious that relationship was is questionable. Whether it was just it was a useful way of distracting his family while he's planning to take over France. She was very glad not to marry, although she had an absolutely terrible marriage, which does have the knock-on effect of making her independently wealthy, and helps her to set up her fantastic salon. She has her father Jerome and her brother, who becomes known as Plon Plon because he can't pronounce Napoleon. These are fantastically debauched, selfish creatures who are constantly leeching off their daughter and sister. But yes, so salon life is central to France, and of course, it's also where a lot of the political intrigue is going on in that period while he's president. That's where the plots, either Republican or monarchist, or Bonapartist. Although Bonapartes tend to be a bit on the outside of society because they've been excluded for so long. But Matilda does become an important, and she's one of the more reasonable members of his family. Mm-hmm. There's an incredibly shallow pool of talent in the Bonaparte family by this point. And she is probably the only one who is vaguely reasonable and helpful to him.
So he doesn't end up marrying Matilda. He ends up marrying, the much more beautiful Eugenie. And maybe we can talk a bit more about her later. She ends up as Empress Eugenie. And there was a great anecdote, because I was speaking to Justin Marozzi the other day about Islamic slavery. And I learned that Eugenie made a great impression on, I think it was Sultan Abdulaziz, who's, then the ruler of the Ottoman Empire, when he visits Paris in 1867. And then she does a return visit to go back to visit the Suez Canal, and she drops in on the Sultan. And there was some terrible contretemps in the harem, and I just wondered if you wanted to tell that anecdote.
Yes, that's a great story. So it's Eugenie's walking through the palace with the Sultan, and I think it's evening by this point. He's just showing her around, very innocent, but passes his mother, who was absolutely shocked to see he has a European woman on his arm, and assumes that it's some kind of a woman of questionable morals, perhaps, shall we say. And she punches Eugenie in the stomach. in outrage. And then a furious argument in Turkish ensues before the Sultan has to apologize profusely to Eugenie and say, I'm terribly sorry, my mother thought that something slightly disrespectful was going on. So that's a fantastic story, which Eugenie told to none other than Queen Victoria, because they became great friends, and they very much enjoyed laughing about it.
To me, it's quite interesting that Eugenie is introduced to the Turkish harem because Napoleon III famously, well, maybe he would have been better off if he would have had a harem, but he kind of has the European equivalent, which is that he has numerous mistresses. And I sort of feel like the details of his mistresses, they're so outrageous that, it would almost be an X-rated podcast if we were to discuss them in detail. But I do want to discuss them in detail. So my thought was, let's leave this episode here and move on to part 2, the X-rated episode, in the next podcast episode, if that's okay with you. So what do you think to that?
I think that's an excellent idea. Yes, we should warn listeners that they're getting into a world of lechery and debauchery that's shocking even to the French at the time.
Okay, so let's leave it there. And for those very few listeners who enjoy sex scandals on a truly massive scale, we look forward to you joining us in part 2. But until then, thank you very much, Edward Shawcross.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed it.